90 regular ER verbs. Attacher, which means to fasten. Attirer, which means to attract. Déclarer, which means to declare. Enregistrer, which means to check in. Voler, which means to fly or to steal. Trouver, which means to find. Traverser, which means to cross. Travailler, which means to work. Tousser, which means to cough. Tourner, which means to turn. Tomber, which means to fall. Tirer, which means to pull. Téléphoner, which means to telephone. Souligner, which means to underline. Souhaiter, which means to wish. Sonner, which means to ring. Soigner, which means to take care of. Siffler, which means to whistle. Sauter, which means to jump. Saluer, which means to greet. Rêver, which means to dream. Rester, which means to stay. Rentrer, which means to return. Rencontrer, which means to meet. Regretter, which means to be sorry. Regarder, which means to look at. Ramasser, which means to collect. Raconter, which means to narrate. Quitter, which means to leave. Prier, which means to pray. Prêter, which means to lend. Pousser, which means to push. Poser, which means to place or to ask. Porter, which means to carry or to wear. Pleurer, which means to cry. Penser, which means to think. Peigner, which means to comb. Passer, which means to pass. Parler, which means to speak. Pardonner, which means to pardon. Oublier, to forget. Nommer, which means to name. Monter, which means to climb. Montrer, which means to show. Marcher, which means to walk. Manquer, which means to miss. Louer, which means to rent. Laisser, which means to leave. Laver, which means to wash. Jouer, which means to play. Ignorer, which means to ignore. Habiter, which means to live in. Goûter, which means to taste. Garder, which means to guard. Gagner, which means to win. FUMER, which means to smoke. FRAPPER, which means to strike. Fermer, which means to close. Féliciter, which means to congratulate. Expliquer, which means to explain. Étudier, which means to study. Épouser, which means to marry. Entrer, which means to enter. Entourer, which means to surround. Enseigner, which means to teach. Embrasser, which means to kiss. Écouter, which means to listen. Échouer, which means to fail. Donner, which means to give. Dîner, which means to have dinner. Dessiner, which means to draw. Demander, which means to ask. Déjeuner, which means to have lunch. Danser, which means to dance. Crier, which means to shout. Coûter, which means to cost. Couper, which means to cut. Compter, which means to count. Commander, which means to order. Chercher, which means to search. Chanter, which means to sing. Casser, which means to break. Brûler, which means to burn. Briller, which means to shine. Bavarder, which means to gossip. Apporter, which means to bring. Ajouter, which means to add. Aimer, which means to like. Adorer, which means to adore. Aider, which means to help.